Adeline, do you want to proceed and talk about Glia?
So good morning. I find it actually somewhat intimidating because our group is much younger. We've only been around for 2 years and probably a little bit after ALD Connect. I'm so impressed with the work you've done in Friedreich's ataxia. I think it's quite encouraging of what's possible with the time and support. So I'm Adeline Vanderver. I'm from Children's National in Washington, D.C. I'm very much like Florian, a clinician scientist in leukodystrophies, and I think we share a lot of the same goals and aspirations. We've taken a slightly different approach to it because ours is not disease specific, it's much more disease agnostic. And I think Florian asked me to come speak to everyone today just to share a little bit about what Glia is doing. Many of the people who are in ALD Connect are actually also in Glia, so there's large areas of overlap. And I think it's important to know sort of how we might be able to collaborate. And I'm going to apologize ahead of time. I'm not feeling, I was a little bit sick and my voice is not perfect. And so if you can please raise your hand if I'm not speaking loudly or clearly enough, I'd appreciate it. So first of all, who are the Glia members? And I have one major oversight that Dean is going to slap my hand for, in that I left out the slide with all our advocacy group supports, because we actually formed Glia mainly because of our advocacy support group. So Dean from the MLD Foundation and Don Hobson from the PMD Foundation and the group from Hunter's Hope and many of the other members of the Leukodystrophy Alliance really badgered us into doing this in the hopes of responding to an RDCRN application a couple of years ago. And much like Florian was describing with the PCORI, our RDCRN application was just not mature enough to be funded. But ironically enough, every single thing that we said we were going to do as part of the RDCRN application, we've actually already done. And so I think it speaks to the power of going ahead and just putting one foot in front of the other and doing it. We actually have members not just in the US and not just clinical sites, but also basic science sites. But we also have sites slowly around the world. And although I haven't put them up because we're not quite ready yet as far as they're concerned, we also have members now in South America, and we're really working to have a global distribution of our partners. I think the other important thing as far as who is this concept of disease-specific versus disease-agnostic. And I think ALD Connect is really lucky because you're really in this group of disorders, right? But I think it's important to recognize that there's a small percentage of leukodystrophies, and most importantly, a small percentage of patients with leukodystrophies actually fall on sort of this part of the train. And we all want to get to the front of the train, but most of us are over here in leukodystrophies without even necessarily a known diagnosis, and certainly with no good understanding of the disease mechanisms at hand. And then there are a smaller group where there are known causes, known biomarkers, known tests, but there's no treatment strategy yet. And where treatment strategies might be emerging, but might be missing outcome measures, as people were describing, might be missing a critical biomarker, or even missing a specific therapeutic approach. So what are the goals of Glia? First of all, we're working on a bioregistry. So we have one of our mission statements is to develop a biorepository of clinical data, MRI, and biological samples. Much like you described, we've actually decided that the most pragmatic approach is to retain individual investigators' biobanks, sort of, and have it be a virtual, at least, repository of biological samples. But we're working hard with Neurobank to have a very comprehensive and universal platform where we can collect other clinical data. We also are very focused on diagnosis. One of our advocacy group members worked very hard to get a diagnosis for his son, and actually was probably the first whole genome case or one of the very first that identified a novel disease. And at the time, he actually convinced Illumina himself to do the whole genome for his family. And it tells you how much parents and families are willing to do to achieve a diagnosis, and how crucial that diagnosis is for individual patients. And so we work very hard, and one of the mantras we have is decrease the proportion of unsolved cases to fewer than 10% before 2020. It has long historically stood for leukodystrophies at approximately 50%, which is unacceptable in the era of next-gen sequencing. We're also very focused on natural history. I think everyone recognizes and hopes that as we move forward with potential therapeutic options that we'll have treatments for very many of these conditions. But as someone stated earlier, you really can't go ahead and do a clinical trial if you don't know what the disease looks like, if you can't plan out what ages your patients need to have, how long the trial needs to run, and what kind of effect you're likely to see. And so natural history is a very important part. The other important part about natural history is understanding what already works and what doesn't work. So I think there are rare disease groups. The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation is one of them. The Urea Cycle Foundation is another, that have actually impacted their disease courses significantly, not by developing new molecules, not by implementing novel therapeutic strategies, but just simply by optimizing standard of care. And I think that's one thing that is very important in all leukodystrophies, and that we've asked Keith, who's here too, Van Haren, to take a lead in, and he's done so admirably. So that comes to the standard of care. We've also partnered quite a lot with our advocacy groups to do this. One of the advocacy groups within the Leukodystrophy Alliance, Hunter's Hope, has taken a lead in developing some of these approaches. And then, of course, sort of the ultimate, right, is emerging therapies and making sure that we optimize our platforms to be able to be collaborative with those groups that are developing emerging therapies and are supportive of other investigators. So obviously the goal is just to improve care and management and improve the lives of individuals affected by leukodystrophies. But really the question is how you do these different things. So I'm just going to state a little bit about some of the things that we're doing. So by our registry, we're working hard right now on IRB alignment. People who have already done these things know that this is a non-trivial and often painful exercise. And I have a genetic counselor who's working on that. We have worked closely with Alex, and I want to thank him and his group, Roger particularly, who have conference calls with our coordinators to actually create new neuronext forms that we can incorporate within clinical care to diminish the burden of data entry. We're also working on standard sample processing approaches so that we can have, even though it's a virtual biorepository that might be at multiple different institutions, have standardized protocols for how those samples are collected to be sure that in those 50 samples that get sent to a pharma company, that 25 are not collected in a different way than the other 25, which I think is a very important aspect. And then work overall on information sharing across sites to make it possible to for one investigator in one place to know what kind of samples and what kind of patients another investigator might have access to. Diagnosis, we again are most of the disorders that I personally care for are not yet amenable to newborn screening, but we're really starting to think about what the future might look like in newborn screening. And Dean, who's one of our members and sitting quietly over there, recently hosted a newborn screening meeting, and I know that we're thinking quite a bit about how to change that landscape of newborn screening. I think that right now the disorders that are amenable to newborn screening are those that really have enzymatic and other biochemical tests, but I think that's really a snapshot in time, and in the future we're going to be having next-gen based newborn screening, and newborn screening is going to be something that's going to be expandable to all the leukodystrophies, which I think will change the diagnostic landscape quite a bit. Right now, though, we still have many patients who become symptomatic and who do not yet have a diagnosis, and I think one of the things that we have done, and we've just launched this, is we're working hard to create evidence so that we can advocate with our third-party payers and insurance companies that next-gen sequencing is a must for patients with leukodystrophy. So we've launched LeukoSeq with a partnership of Illumina, which is really looking at clinical utility of next-generation-based approaches in the leukodystrophies and enrolling 200 families in a whole genome sequencing platform. We also have worked hard within the group to identify novel disorders to further decrease the rate of unsolved leukodystrophies, and we are proud to include members in our Glia group such as Mario Vanderknapp, who's, I think, defined probably a dozen leukodystrophies. I stopped counting quite a while ago, and work closely with her. And then I think an important part is education. There is a lack of awareness of the leukodystrophies. We are publishing a small paper that just goes over how comfortable people are with leukodystrophies and how comfortable they are at diagnosing them. And I think when we polled members of the Society of Inborn Metabolic Diseases and the Child Neurology Society, who should be sort of our frontline people for leukodystrophies, right? These are child neurologists, these are biochemical geneticists. If there's anybody in the medical community that knows about these disorders, it should be them. And I think it was 64% felt completely uncomfortable with the diagnosis of a patient with a leukodystrophy, which is an astounding number to me. Natural history, Josh Bonkowski and Keith Van Haren have helped quite a bit with this, and we have a work group within our Glia group that's specifically looking at how we can establish validated measures for the patients with leukodystrophies. I think if you look at the broader, sort of more diagnostic leukodystrophy population, we're in a little bit of a different situation than ALD is, because so many of our patients are so much younger that a lot of the established measures that might be useful for you, for example, where you can borrow from the adult population in MS, where there's very good validated measures, actually it might not translate to a much younger child with MLD, Krabbe, or a hypomyelinating leukodystrophies. And so I think we have particular challenges there, looking at a more agnostic group that are a little bit different than the measures we've discussed this morning. So we have a physical therapist, a physiatrist, a speech therapist, Maria Escolar, and several other people who are looking together at what we can create as far as validated measures that could be used across trials for the leukodystrophies. And I'm going to take your advice. I'm in Washington D.C. I'm going to go knock on the FDA's door early. I think the other question is, how much of those need to be disease-specific? And certainly, although the leukodystrophies overall have a lot of shared features, right, there are certain features that are very disease-specific, either in endocrine function or in other physical medical functions. And I think thinking a little bit about what module aspects we need to have is something our group is considering as well. And then outcome predictors, really what are those things that the FDA is going to consider almost a clinical biomarker of efficacy? Are things we're being very thoughtful about right now, and that's important, as I said, not just for clinical care, for clinical trials, but also for clinical care. So, what are those predictors in your natural history that tell you this child should have a G tube now rather than in 6 months? What is going to predict your first aspiration pneumonia? What is going to predict your need for a spinal fusion because you haven't adequately manage your spasticity? There are real improvements to be made in clinical management of these children without even creating new therapeutic approaches. And so again, Keith has been very helpful with this, and we actually are meeting on October 6th. I'm seeing many of you again next week, specifically to discuss some of these clinical features that we need to look at to develop standards of care and how we can make those evidence-based. And we are having that meeting in Washington, D.C. next week. And again, Jackie, who's not here today, often speaks about living with instead of dying of a leukodystrophy as a crucial thing to get through to practitioners, because I think that those of us who care for these patients have often encountered, an orthopedic surgeon who's not willing to do a hip surgery because the child has a leukodystrophy, but that orthopedic surgeon doesn't realize that that child's going to be living with the discomfort of that orthopedic problem for several years, and that you really need to be considering the here and now and how we can improve quality of life. And of course, this needs to be multidisciplinary, so for our October 6th meeting, we've pulled in specialists from multiple different areas of medical care, and most importantly, it needs advocates and patients, because those of us who are seeing patients in clinic, once every 3 or 6 months, don't live in the shoes of those families every day, and you best know what is actually important to improving quality of life. We also, as our last point, are focused on emerging therapies, and Ali Fatimi at Kennedy Krieger is taking a lead here to help us be thoughtful about what platforms we need to validate new genetic findings and to validate new concepts about mechanism of disease, what biomarkers we might need for long-term applications in clinical trials, and also how we can best explore disease mechanisms to look at novel treatment strategies. So this is quite a to-do list, right? And I think one of the key things that, Florian, you spoke about is this concept of one versus many. This is quite a daunting to-do list to begin with. Should you really do it for one leukodystrophy at a time? Are there leukodystrophies that we should focus on because they're closer to therapies? Or are we really looking at doing it for many? And I would argue, and I have in Glia, that really there's so much overlap in so many of these that it's still reasonable to do it for many disorders at the same time. There are, of course, conflicts, right, in trying to think about these large collaborative groups. And I put a brick wall, not just as a not in a not only decorative sense, in the sense that I think that a lot of times these things can really create significant pitfalls. And I've put sort of concepts as conflicts, and I don't want you to think that I think that one of them is better than the other. For example, individual investigator needs versus broader programmatic benefits. You could say that each one of us as an individual investigator needs to put aside our, like the first quote, if you forget about who is going to take the credit, it's amazing how much you can get done. The problem is that individual investigator needs to get enough credit to be sustained, to still be there, to be with the big group, right? If you can't sustain that individual investigator, they're going to go off and get a different job, in all honesty, and then they won't be there to help the bigger group. So these are not trivial things to consider. I already talked about the disease-specific versus a more agnostic approach. Again, you can say, oh, well, we have to, help all the leukodystrophies all the time, but really, we only have 24 hours in a day, and is that really realistic? So, do we need to be thoughtful about what we push forward? And then this competing versus collaborative overlapping programs, again, much like the investigators, I think between what ALD Connect is doing, between what the Leukodystrophy Alliance is doing, between what even other disease groups are doing, are we, in what way can we collaborate, and in what way are we actually competing with one another for limited resources or patients, right? And then this concept of, limited resources versus increasing awareness. And what I mean by that is that, if we are all advocating within a certain space, are we actually competing for each other for grants, for example, or for attention from different regulatory agencies? Or as we're all sort of making noise about the same kind of things, are we just increasing awareness and increasing interest in this group of disorders? And then individual patients versus populations. Again, that gets into some of this concepts of disease specific versus agnostic, and again, I want to credit ALD Connect. They're really actually doing most of these things, so that you are already in this space for almost all of these to-do lists in an ALD focused way, and specifically for things like the patient portal for natural history. And you've done a lot in education of diagnosis. I very much admired some of your videos for families and practitioners, and in banking. But I think that, again, if you are lucky that you're here at the front of the train, right, that doesn't mean that all these other people don't equally need us to think about their issues. And the other thing is that in this sort of alphabet soup of disorders, right, who knows how, as Florian, you already said, how much these other disorders might actually impact our understanding of what is occurring in ALD, and in the inflammatory pathology of ALD, how much some of these more pro-inflammatory leukodystrophies might actually be informative. And so obviously the goal is to get all these patients up on this front of the train, and hopefully that's something that we can do together.
Great. That was great, Adeline. So absolutely, I think everybody at the front of the train. I think what we're here to do is sort of try to together answer some of these hard questions if we can, I think. I guess I would start off by saying it's not that we don't care. It's about how do we approach it, right? So I think I have many other patients here from different disease groups, and one of the questions I'm struggling with is how do we move things forward, and what is the right approach? So speaking of agnostic to specific genes, so there have been efforts before, right? LeukoNext and LeukoTreat in Europe, right? So how does Glia interact with those organizations? Or ELA, let's say also, yeah?
Yeah, so I think not formally, in part more because of our how young of an organization we are, right? But I've reached out to the members of Leukodystrophy, and I am on the scientific board of ELA, right? And so I think that there's a lot of informal connections, even if there's no formal connections at this time.
And maybe Jen, you could speak a little bit to how did Friedreich's ataxia deal historically or presently with the fact that there are many ataxias, right? And there's a single gene, and how dare you go after that one gene and not care about all the other ataxias?
I didn't mean to say that that's what you were doing, right?
I'm trying to bring it to a point.
Yeah. There are other groups out there. There's a National Ataxia Foundation that doesn't select one ataxia, that covers all inherited ataxias. And muscular dystrophy associated. So Friedreich's ataxia is also one of the 40-some diseases under the muscular dystrophy banner as well. And so, you know, it's and the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation is another organization we've worked with, and you know, what we like to when we sit down with those other organizations, what we like to say is, you know, you've got a lot more bandwidth than we do in a lot of ways. I mean, certainly an organization like MDA, they have a whole lot more bandwidth than we do. We can benefit from partnering with them because they're having insights across neuromuscular disease. And they might come across something, whether it's a new drug or a biomarker or a measure that's being developed in one of their other diseases that could be applicable in FA that we wouldn't otherwise know about because we're so FA focused. Whereas if they're spreading themselves across 40 diseases, they can't be an expert in FA either. And so maybe we apply our FA specific focus to help them, and they can help us by making sure we know what's going on in the greater neuromuscular community. We've actually just signed a memo of understanding with the MDA. We've worked with them for years, partnered co-funding grants, conferences together, but we really formalized that alliance this year and said, you know, here are the things we're going to work on. One of them is career development awards for young scientists. Because we're having trouble bringing new scientists to FA, and MDA has a much broader reach. And so if they can reach out to their bigger community and we can get some young people some FA-specific awards, hopefully we'll grow new interest. On the advocacy front, there are lots of issues that we can work on together. And then for our patient registry and natural history study, there's kids getting treated in MDA clinics that are not in our patient registry. And so we're trying to figure out how we work together to get the folks in the MDA clinic into our registry, but also not, you know, step on each other's toes too much. They're not easy issues to tackle, some of them, but I think the fact that, you know, if everybody comes to the table with we can learn together, we don't want to duplicate effort. I think you can do both. You can be disease specific, but you can also work across a broader platform.
Yeah, I think I agree. I don't think it's an either or. And you were talking earlier about a concept that I thought was important, which is making sure we're filling the gaps, you know? And the problem with if we have only disease-specific focused groups is that you're going to have, first of all, those patients who don't have their disease-specific group or who don't have a diagnosis are totally falling between, between available options. But also, I think that there are things that bridge the different groups that are also being missed. So I think it's not an either or. It's a sum is more than the total of the parts.
Yeah, no. So I agree. So maybe Ali, I'd love to also hear from Elise from ELA. But maybe so briefly, what is your philosophy and how have you approached this and how have you reconciled some of these tensions? What's the best way to serve all is I guess the looming question, and is that best done by creating a joint platform, or is it really that there are these individual passionate efforts in different diseases?
Okay. I might not have all the answers today. And you say, I'm from ILA. I'm Elisa Vivar. I just joined the ILA Foundation a month and a half ago, so that's why I will not have all your answers today. But I'm here. First of all, I'm really delighted to be here and meet you all of you. ILA is also looking at all the leukodystrophies and not only EALD. As you said, we don't have yet formal collaborations, and we're certainly looking forward to increase those collaborations. We are working to help the patients on a daily basis. We have people devoted to taking care of the patients. We're an association of patients primarily, and we also have the will to help research. We have calls for projects yearly that we grant. And we also are developing a network platform, Leuconnect, that will be hopefully up and running early 2016, with the goal of connecting the people with the disease. So we are based in Paris, and historically we are based in France, and we've had lots of changes on the structure of the association, and we are still in processing that, and it's not totally clear yet, but our goal is really to turn towards the more international research and on leukodystrophies. We have ILA implanted in several European countries, and I'm really here to make it happen, that we can work together internationally and connect with the US and connect with ALD Connect and also with Glia. And so how we can help and work together, I think it's interesting that we are in Europe and you are in the US, and those are the two major research development funding places in the world. Well, we certainly want to fund research everywhere in the world, wherever the talent is and wherever the research is. Then I guess come to me. Let's get together and talk about what we can do. I'm sure we don't want to do overlap of things that will be maybe conflicting. That's why we don't want to disperse funding. We are funded essentially by a donation of the people. We want to try increase awareness and get that money, but get good use of it, and not just by duplicating things. It could be difficult, obviously, but I think we can complement a lot by being on two different sides of the ocean.
Yeah, I think I really like that slide at the end with the wall, and it comes back to the point we had yesterday with industry and talking about the pre-competitive space. I think what will be important here is to define that pre-competitive space here. And yes, from an industry perspective, it seemed like natural history is the one thing that they all want to have in common, and they are all mutually interested, and that will be the place to share. And I think on the investigator side, what I think is the pre-competitive space where there shouldn't be really competition is patients themselves. I think reducing the amount of ownership about a patient is important here, to appreciate that, it's not that, it doesn't make sense to say, well, I have these 5 and you have those 3, and I think that's where we can really come together, is by trying to share on that aspect with collecting the natural history with these databases. I think that's one of the things that I see. Competition is great. Should there be competition between sites? There should be. We are in a free market. We live in this country because it's a free market country, supposedly, and so competing for, say, grants that allow you to get funded and where the best scientific proposal should be selected makes sense, because that's going to advance science. On the other hand, I think there is a lot of space here for things where it makes sense to be in a non-competing setting, the pre-competitive space, and share, and that's the collection of natural history.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually the challenge here, is recognizing in this day and age that there might be so many different levels at which one could be sharing and working together. So it could be on a, I sit on various boards or meetings where we're just talking about genes and targets and pathways, and boy, you hear about a lot more diseases across the board, and even beyond the nervous system, and would you want to sort of have those fold into traditional disciplines or categories that we've adhered to in academic institutions? I'm not sure anymore, to say the truth. So, so I think that's vital, and So some of these thoughts we should keep holding on to and seeing whether over time there are easy ways to find synergies where we want to take a step forward. I think we all agree we don't want to duplicate efforts. We want to share to accelerate each other's goals and make things happen faster. And whether it's on preclinical side, it's on a clinical side, I think we all have the same goal: to bring treatment to patients, to incentivize new discoveries at the bench.